Are we waiting on people or should I? Okay. Okay. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us for this today. I'm Yukti. I'm the co-founder and the director of the Center for Restoration. We are a non-profit organization that works on gender-based violence in universities and colleges, specifically using approaches of trauma work and restorative justice. Annually, with all of the handful of organizations that work on restorative justice globally, the third week of November we observe as Restorative Justice Week, which is just an opportunity for us to be able to connect with people in various lines of other work and just have a conversation about justice, have a conversation about where restorative justice can benefit different people, and so I personally am not a lawyer. Although I do work in some lines of international law, particularly with humanitarian international law. But I'm very happy to not be a lawyer because, like many restorative justice practitioners, we do tend to have a bit of a contentious relationship with criminal justice. And so I'm very happy to do a Friday forum where we can have one moment of peace and pretend like the criminal justice system doesn't exist. There are going to be two parts in which I'm doing this, where with the first part, I'm specifically focusing on the entrenchment of the vocabulary of criminal justice when we're talking about violence in particular. And the second part is a little bit more participatory, but nothing too intense, catered to people who may have come after a long day at work. And on that note, please feel free to engage with this material to the level that you feel capable of at the moment, or the level that you want to. Because please feel free to prioritize just how you're feeling at the moment, how your day has been, because some of this material can also be a little bit intense. I've concentrated a lot of the discussion on violence specifically from my end, particularly to gender-based violence, because that is the area where I've been able to see a lot of the nuance as a practitioner and a researcher. But I know that people at ALF have a lot of experience working specifically with maybe caste or human rights or other areas where violence and its intersections with law become very relevant. So also just inviting you to maybe engage with that material if you would want to, bring it up in the inputs, whatever it is. But yeah, just for the sake of being able to go in depth into that explanation of violence, I am looking at gender-based violence. So please engage at the level that's comfortable for you. If there is something that's uncomfortable, if you want to step out for a minute, come back in, that's all perfectly fine. And prioritize your well-being with this. To start, just going to start with two questions, and please write down your answers. But we're not going to talk about this right now. We're going to revisit the answers a little bit later into the conversation. And don't think too much about this. It's basically the first words that come to your mind. Now, for the first question, please write down as many words as first come to your mind. And it's just this: what happens when you think of justice? For the next one, just the first word that comes to your mind, just one, and almost like free association. Don't think about it too much. If I want justice, where should I go? I did want a little bit of an idea of like what to expect with these answers, so I also asked TCR's Instagram before I came here, and there were a couple of answers that really stood out to me, and I think then drove how I was going about this conversation. The fact that somebody said impossible to get with a question mark, somebody said the fight for justice and punishment. I mean, all the other words as well, there's a lot to think about with those. But just focusing on these three in particular and starting with the fight for justice, I think it's like when I say the word justice, it can be interpreted in a lot of ways. It's like maybe you know what it means to you, maybe just what it means theoretically. But the fight to justice brings a very particular kind of image in mind, especially when we contextualize it with GBV. I mean, I immediately thought of all of the images that we see of protests pertaining to specific cases, what they look like, and it's the idea that justice is something that you have to fight for when it comes to those cases. It's like, and there's no maybe consensus on what is the justice that is being fought for as well. Because if you, I mean, look at the kind of posters that people will hold up, some of them will say, okay, we want the justice to be speedy. There can't be any justice that's delayed. So then the idea is that yes, the law has to provide that justice and it has to act as quickly as possible, because justice delayed is justice denied. But then you will also have, just the fight for justice will also just have slogans that say, stop gender violence. We need to come together to stop gender violence. I saw this one particular poster, and that has stayed with me, which said something about chop off the tool of raping, which also is a very particular kind of take on justice. And really, like, what is it that is wanted out of this as a process? What do any of the people there kind of collectively want to engage with at that point? And it's like justice is this, elusive concept of somebody wants violence out of it. Somebody wants some form of retribution. Somebody just wants the due process to be taken, and to be taken right to the book, sticking to the book, and going forward with that. But it's also about punishment quite often. Maybe, that is one thing that's tying that entire narrative of the fight for justice together. The idea that a crime has happened, violence has happened, and it just can't go unaddressed. We can't have a situation where nothing happens, and because we don't know what can happen, maybe violence is what can happen. And when we start thinking about justice as a fight, or a fight for justice, we also start thinking of the other ways in which the image of a fight comes off when we're talking about justice quite often. Whether, it's in the courtroom, the fighting for a verdict, fighting for the punishment. The question is, whom is that justice for, right? The person that is, any of the varieties of the ideas of, say, retributive violence is what will bring justice, or putting somebody in prison will bring justice, or punishing somebody will bring justice. Who does that justice impact? Who does it benefit? And those are two very different things. I mean, it impacts the person who may have caused that harm. It impacts their immediate community. It impacts their family. But who is it for? Is it for the state? Is it for the sake of law? Like, law exists, it has to be followed, and here we are. Who is it really for? My first experience engaging with criminal justice, the system on the whole, was when I was 20 in college and became a member of the internal complaints committee of that university. Every university, according to the POSH law, is supposed to have an internal complaints committee, just as workplaces are, which is a quasi-judicial body that handles all cases of sexual harassment and more broadly gender-based violence. Something very interesting happens when you find yourself in that process is that I think I spent a lot of time initially questioning how much of this was quasi-judicial and how much of it was judicial and how much of it was community. And just during my time there, my particular ICC had this incredible problem where one day we would be adjudicating on a case, and the second day the person who had caused the harm or perpetrated any form of harm, their parents would call the vice chancellor, and the third day we would wake up to magically poof, the case no longer exists, it's in the air, we don't know what happened to it, and we will never talk about it again. This was a university that had a rampant problem of gender-based violence, as I was going to learn because of my position, not because of the cases that came to the committee, but because of the cases that's being brought to my notice in particular. And that's where that confusion sort of began, right? Because I was part of that community. I was also part of the committee. And it did reach a point where, say, I'm hearing from 10 or 20 people every day if say a Me Too movement is going on, if say anything has propelled that discourse within that university. But in my entire duration there, the committee itself may have seen maybe 5 cases or maybe 6 cases near the end. So what I realized was that it's not like I had the power to change what was happening with their cases in any capacity, but I was going to listen and I was going to try. And I did develop a reputation for bringing in some magical negotiation powers that I didn't know I previously possessed, just in terms of being able to negotiate, say, a restraining order, or a don't talk to this person order, or it will be seen as retaliation, or stay away from them in class. But these were not things that the ICC was addressing in itself either, because they also suffered from a very blatant limitation of imagination about what they could do with that form of justice, or what they could offer to students that were coming in for the case, or what they were supposed to offer really. Say if a case comes to their notice and their preoccupation is with which of the rules of the university have been broken, then they are rectifying the idea that you act in accordance with what the harm that has been done. You kind of reverse that in the justice that you're giving, but the harm is taken to be the harm that is done to the rule book itself. You have harmed the rules that we have by not abiding by them, and the equal opposite justice response to that is, well, you're making good to the rule book, but you're not really making good to the person that you have caused that harm to. And every single student that I ever heard the story of, and it was honestly way too many, just wanted to be believed. But more tangibly, what they actually wanted from the university, and the only reason they were filing a complaint with an ICC that was notoriously known for this, was because they didn't know how else to ensure their safety. They didn't know who they could. They didn't know how else to prevent this from happening again. University campuses are tiny spaces. You are necessarily going to run into the person that has caused you harm again and again. You're also going to run into their communities. Maybe you have the same friends, maybe you have the same classes, and there's no handbook really for how to kind of navigate that. It definitely is not imbibed inside the internal complaints committee's policy, which are generally just adapted from whatever a workspace would need, despite the fact that they're really not the same at all. So we come to this question of, or at least at that particular point, when I'm seeing that people want to be believed, they want justice, I think, for most of them. Not safety, but justice would have just looked like being able to retain their mutual friends, being the people that don't have to defend their side of the narrative, being the people that have some say in what happens next. The ICC may not have had, the capacity to do that, but I mean, one can argue that it can have the capacity to do that. And I think that's where we arrive at the point of when we start criticizing the criminal legal system for its inability to meet certain needs, where does that start and where does that end? Because first, a lot of this can be chalked down to problems with implementation of the law, whether the law was being implemented properly, whether it was being implemented effectively. So this is to say that, you know, if cases are going poof magically, then the law is not being implemented properly, and a correct implementation of this law could perhaps fix it. But say we have a policy, or say we have a law against gender based violence that actually properly, comprehensively covers the typologies of violence, covers the consequences of violence, and implements them. No thanks. Yeah. What we then have is a problem is with the substance of the law itself, which may not cover every single form that it actually needs to. So say our current laws for gender-based violence actually had a great rate of implementation. Everybody was able to access them. People were able to file complaints. Common discourse. We know that marital rape isn't criminalized. We know that gender-based violence laws typically only consider cis women to be the people that can be victimized. When gender-based violence is an issue that impacts and implicates people of all genders, there's so much that's missing in that substance then, right? And then the next question is, okay, what if we fix the substance? What if we have a law that covers all genders, it covers all of these typologies of violence, and it is implemented, it is accessible? Then we still come to the question of whose needs are being met by it. Because if that ICC policy that I was working with, which was a great ICC policy, I think they severely lacked in implementation, but the substance was great. It was a policy that was developed out of a lot of student movement, so it did take into account a lot of the issues that would come up. Whose needs are being met at the end of the day when the sanctions are just kind of retributing what has happened to the policy itself? So say somebody is expelled even from the university, or somebody is suspended, or in the larger criminal justice system, somebody goes to prison, right? Ultimately, they're going to get out of prison. And even the act of them going to the prison itself, like what is that really doing for the person that has already been harmed? Isn't this really about the needs of the state being met by the criminal justice system itself, while not really meeting the needs of the person that has been harmed in the first place? At what point does the criminal justice system stop and ask, what is justice to you? Like, what do you need right now? And who is it asking that to? At this particular point, I was just like, well, what is the point? So I went to ChatGPT and I asked it, what is the point of legal punishment? And I know, I mean, it's, those 4 ones, I'm sure the lawyers know about retribution and deterrence, but I wanted to simplify it down to just kind of look at it this way. And here I want to take a view of what's actually happening with the legal system before we get into this. We know that prisons across the world have an overrepresentation of the most marginalized populations of that particular place. We know with gender-based violence in specific that underreporting is rampant, and is something we'll discuss more in specific as well. That most cases are never reported. Out of the cases that are reported, very few actually lead to a conviction, and out of the few that lead to a conviction, it doesn't really amount to much at the end of the day, right? So does punishment serve as a warning and discourage people from committing similar crimes, especially when we're looking at gender-based violence? Not really, because bulk of gender-based violence is intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is not the bulk of the reasons people are going to prison for gender-based violence, and as a result, that's not really working out. And then, the idea that the person who has been punished is deterred from reoffending since their actions had negative consequences. But we know that the rates of people committing the same offenses after they leave prison are really high. So we have no evidence that this is happening either. Retribution, or ensuring that people face consequences that are proportional to the harm they caused, but caused, again, to the law, not to the person they actually caused that harm to, because that is the yardstick by which we're measuring this. Rehabilitation, prisons, I don't know, that doesn't sound like that was taken into account while they were making, I don't think people told the people making the prisons that rehabilitation was the goal, because it doesn't seem to be panning out either. And after this, ChatGPT got a little too real, at which point I was like, okay, this needs to go verbatim. So firstly, the fact that if a person is in prison, or if, with the death penalty, they've been put to death, they can't commit more crimes, which again How does that prevent crimes on whole? And how is that justice? Who is that justice for? Then we can maintain social order. I mean, they did get that right, and they did get the expression of societal values right, because punishment is a statement of the community's values, signaling that certain behaviors, like being a black man in the US and being Dalit or Muslim in India, are unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of the question of what this is doing. And very frankly, if there was any other system of the state, any other state institution that was failing so badly at its set goals and had been failing for over 200 years now, we would be reconsidering it. But that's not really what happens with the law as well, because it is fulfilling the goals that it set out to do. It's just that the goals that it set out to do may not have been compatible with the goals of justice to begin with. Yeah, but it is maintaining, upholding laws and norms. I find that also really interesting in terms of the idea that punishment is to uphold the rule of law itself, which is to say the rule of law exists in order to uphold the rule of law. A very self-serving process where we wind up with lawyers being the primary stakeholders engaging with the law and with each other and then with the law, and that's pretty much it. But when we again examine the question of what is violence and we actually look at, examine the question of what is justice, but reoriented to taking a very in-depth look of what kind of violence is happening, is where we can again start asking the question of what kind of justice is required or what justice can really mean. And as I said, I'm going to do this with gender-based violence. And ideally, I would have wanted to start with reporting GBV against gender diverse persons, because if I was going by the gender that is facing the most frequency of gender-based violence, it is them. But I'm going with gender-based violence against women, cis women in particular, simply because we have the most information about it. All the laws that kind of exist, they're already, this is the exact kind of scenario they're catering to technically. We already know what the reporting is looking like, and that seems like a good place to start. The scale of violence, and this is from the National Health Survey, the fifth one, which is that almost 1 in 3 women in India have faced physical or sexual violence. But out of these, 80% of the cases of GBV are intimate partner violence. And this reflects a pattern that exists globally, with intimate partner violence consistently being the most prevalent form of gender-based violence, only accounting for physical and sexual violence. So when we start accounting for emotional violence, verbal violence, financial violence, social violence, that number is likely to rise. And over here, with all of these laws that are set up for this exact demographic to be able to report the cases, we don't have much reporting, because 77% of the people that were surveyed did not tell anybody. And we're not talking about telling, bringing the criminal legal institutions into it. We're talking about telling absolutely anybody. 6% out of all the cases of IPV, all the cases of GBV in general, are actually going to the police, whereas the people that are being most accessed for support, for justice, are immediate family and immediate community. So that's a pretty high statistic on women going to their own family. And again, that is also probably happening because of the fact that intimate partner violence in marital relationships is mainly what is coming out from all of these surveys. But friends, communities. So with that taken into account, what is justice going to look like? Who is the justice for, with the current systems that we have to be able to redress this? And from there, it's only downwards. Because when we talk about gender-based violence against men, there is a very critical lack of data on the kind of gender-based violence that is happening, on the kind, the scale, the nature, the scope, everything. And that has led to a very interesting phenomena research-wise, where there is a lot of really shady research out there about gender-based violence that men are experiencing. These are from 2 different papers, but both papers, along with a bunch of other papers, constantly quote that 51.5% males are experiencing violence at the hands of their wives and intimate partners in their lifetime. And this is just India. There's also a notable lack of any other form of gender-based violence that research is happening on, right? And sometimes you just have to read those papers a little bit longer to realize what the problem is, because one of these papers is in their first description of what violence against men by women look like, have described withholding sex as a form of violence, and the other paper has hit this little gem inside it, that half the people that they have interviewed, in half of those cases, the husband initiated the physical and emotional violence first, but then whatever. The problem is that when we have people working on intimate partner violence that don't understand intimate partner violence, don't understand the dynamics, and also don't understand reactive abuse, the concept that people in an abusive dynamic may wind up reacting to the abuse with actions that can look like abuse but are just reactions. When we don't have a trauma-informed lens into that data, I mean, we wind up with the fact that none of these research papers, I mean, they're happening in a very biased, partial manner. But the larger problem here is that the reason this is happening is because we don't have the data. And why do we not have the data? Is because most of the data about gender-based violence is directly linked to the existence of laws about gender-based violence. And we don't have laws about gender-based violence against men. Is intimate partner violence against men happening? Yes. The same survey about about the violence that women are facing also noted that 4% of ever married women have initiated physical violence against their husband, and that might be a little bit closer to the actual dynamic. But there's a lot of nuance that goes into computing that kind of data, because anybody working in intimate partner violence will realize that when you ask cis men particularly about the kind of violence that they are facing, a lot of men that are actually facing that violence will not define it with the same terms, or will even refuse to define it with the same terms when those terms are given to them. We've seen this with all of the surveys that we've also conducted. The statistic of how many men are facing gender-based violence of all forms goes up considerably when, instead of saying, have you experienced rape, or have you experienced sexual harassment, have you experienced domestic violence, they're given a descriptor. Have you been harmed in an emotional way by an intimate partner? Have you experienced sexual encounter that you did not consent to? And those descriptors take up that statistic significantly higher. Whereas, because of the pushback to the domestic violence legislation, you have a lot of research of this kind that comes up, because that is a terminology that is being then weaponized. So it's a complicated situation to be able to understand the scale and nature of gender-based violence against men. But it is incredibly important to have that data and to have those redressal mechanisms for everybody's safety. And even if it wasn't important for women's safety, it is still important to have gender-neutral laws about gender-based violence, simply because people deserve justice. And that's not happening. That's not happening in the implementation level. It's not happening in the substance level. It's definitely not asking whose needs are being met. There are limited mechanisms for reporting. Those definitions aren't aligning. And why must they align, really? If ultimately the question of justice is asking the correct people what they need, the people who have been harmed what they need, then is there a way for the justice system to be able to make space for whatever vocabulary the other person wants to come in with? Is there a reason why that doesn't happen? I mean, is there a reason why that isn't even allowed to happen, really? And what can happen to our narratives about gender-based violence if it wasn't that way? Across multiple studies, it comes off pretty often that genderqueer people and gender diverse people and queer people face higher rates of sexual and gender-based violence. any of the surveys that are computing that that have that particular angle, repeatedly they've come across the same kind of narrative. Again, it is incredibly difficult to get as reliable data about it, because a lot of times this data is collected based on who is reporting what kind of violence, and there are other massive problems with the possibility of reporting this form of violence as well, simply because even if what has happened is a crime, and I mean a crime in the sense that there is an actual law that can address it or does address it, um, there is a very high risk that queer people face of experiencing secondary victimization if they, or retaliation simply from the police themselves or from the legal system, and just a lot of re-victimization if they choose to go through with that process, if that process chooses to go through with them as well. And that kind of brings us to the fact that the criminal law, the criminal legal system itself is weaponized so often, not just against queer people, but also against other marginalized people, perpetrating a form of systematic violence, denying the existence, denying certain rights, criminalizing certain acts. And what is a criminal legal system supposed to, how is a criminal legal system the tool to address a violence that is being perpetrated by the criminal legal system, is the question that we then arrive at. Once again, limited mechanisms for reporting has the same impacts that it did in, as we saw in the last slide. Yeah. So, with all of that, I think every time I look at what we know, what we don't know, how we're addressing it, what our options are, it always just comes back to this question of, if there is justice, then whom is that justice for? How do we bring that justice back to the person it is supposed to be for? What does justice even mean to us, really, right? And returning to the initial questions of when there is a fight for justice, when a community is leading a fight for justice, do they know what they are asking for? Have they asked the correct people what they are asking for? Do they know what the impact is? Like, whose justice are they fighting for? And that brings us to the second part of this, where I would like to now pretend like there are no courtrooms and no criminal legal system, and then see, collectively what we can come up with in terms of our understanding of justice, or what we are left with when we take it out. So the words that I asked you to write at the beginning, about the words that come to your mind when you associate with justice, we're going to do like a reverse bingo of it. I'm not sure I've been very comprehensive about this, but I've tried to take every single word I could find that links between justice and the criminal legal system, to just ask you that, if your words fall under any of these, just cut them out, and then let's see what we're left with. Like, are there any words ultimately that came to your mind that are beyond this? Would be good places to start. So I'm just going to give you a minute or two to look at your lists again. And yeah. Yes. Yeah, we are. Go on.
So one of the, I think more it's a phrase rather than a word that came to my mind was to grow from slash to move from.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the sexual harassment cases that I have sort of heard about, or like spoken about with the victims themselves, a lot of the times they're like sort of uh, ask after like the whole process begins, or when during the process of let's say an IC procedure or whatever. A lot of it just is like, okay, I need now space to like heal from this and to sort of grow from this, because this is getting too much from you.
Mm-hmm.
So that those were the two like phrases that came to my head. That
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. So, what are the words that got cut out? Sorry? Government? Yeah, I mean, if I forgot to mention it, that's definitely out if we're kicking out the criminal justice system. So,
Education.
perhaps.
Closure.
Am I like writing big enough for it to be visible? Okay.
Rehabilitation and reintegration.
Mm-hmm. Still somewhat, I mean, the spirit may not be legal, but I think the vocabulary is. So, is there any other way that you would want to phrase it? Breaking it down to the bare bones of what is rehabilitation here? What is reintegration?
Basically, what I'm trying to say is,
Mm-hmm.
usually the person who commits a crime, so like he gets cut off from the society. So like once he comes back, even like he realizes his mistake, so it is still sees him as a offender. So that again like make puts him into more vulnerable space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think somewhere we need to like create a space for him to reintegrate with the society and restore his functions.
You also said realizes there mistake. I think the great bit about like when we break them down is that we also wind up with other phrases. Sorry, one second. And you said or say be accepted back into community. I hope I don't drop this.
So one thing that came to my head was bearing witness, and by that I don't mean witness in your usual trial
Mm-hmm.
sense, but in form of memory as to what had happened, how people remember it, and also having agency to remember it in the way it happened to you or your your feelings in the event or incident matter. So bearing witness in the sense that people see the wrong done as if it's wrong. It's a part of wanting to be believed also, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You said this, and you said agency. Do you think bearing witness would also be being listened to,
Yeah. Being heard.
being heard?
Yeah.
And you said agency over narrative specifically.
Like in the criminal trial, if you see,
Mm-hmm.
when for example, starting from the complaint, right?
Mm-hmm.
When victims go to the police station writing a complaint in their own words,
Mm-hmm.
police will immediately say, they'll basically reject it and say it needs to fit the ingredients of the crime.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have to fit your narrative. Like this actually happened with like one of our clients where like the prepping for the examination in chief, like the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
She was asked the way it came to her naturally, the way she wanted to say it, it was like cut down so many times by the public prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
Like to say that you have to show the ingredients of the crime. So you're fitting what happened, how she's feeling into like a formula of sorts, which is given by the law. And if it doesn't fit it, then it's not really a crime. Then it'll be difficult for her. So that felt like violence again.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's what I mean to say by when I say bearing witness or being remembered or like yeah.
Yeah, as a professional hater of the criminal justice system. You're really validating me right now. But yeah, I think also there's so much here when, as you did, we take it back to the criminal justice system to ask exactly these questions of whether this is happening. And I think what your theory about, and I mean, it's not just like one singular case. It is the criminal justice system does require those that terminology. It requires things to be chiseled down in a very specific way so it can fit a very specific rule book. Yeah. Did anyone else have anything that didn't get cut out?
Quite different from everything else is the word innate.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense, I think people have a innate sense of justice, which is not necessarily linked to the justice system,
Yeah.
but something that's beyond it.
So how would you describe that justice? Like, is it a sense of right or wrong, or is it a sense of what is that word?
Like a felt sense.
Yeah, some felt sense of justice that people, that even children feel without really
Mm-hmm.
having the knowledge of the remedies available
Mm-hmm.
of the crimes as they exist in books.
The feeling of justice,
Experiential.
experiential.
Action and response is something that came in.
Mhm.
It's something you mentioned earlier also about everybody wants something to be done. You can't not
right.
let it be done. But like what and all these things.
That justice is action. I really like that.
And the second thing that came to my mind was an agreement or contract, but in a social sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like whether somebody committed a crime or not, we are still living together, which means whatever we move forward with is needs to be agreed upon in
Mhm.
the larger sense. Otherwise, it's not going to be. I don't know. It's not going to last. Like, unless all of us agree to, oh, this is how we're going to do this.
Feel free to, I mean, add to this as well. But also, what about the second question that I had asked in terms of where does one go to get justice? I actually just want to know what the intuitive reaction was and whether there was anything that didn't get cut out.
Only to the court.
Sorry.
It will only to the court.
So court.
What came to me was people. But
Mhm.
if I ask myself, like, what people, it's like anyone that is accessible, whether it's the perpetrator themselves or